Hello everyone. Now we had to adapt a bit because how ironic, the cables somehow didn't work, so we couldn't do the live streaming. I very much hope that it works like this, that you will all be able to see the fourth edition of the DIGI Talk today about exactly the questions about resilience of sea cables and also the resilience of countries and the dependence of sea cables. Thank you so much for joining. I have here with me Dr. Camino Kavanagh. She is a senior, I have to read my notes because you have so many roles. Dr. Kavanagh, she is a senior fellow, of the Department of War Studies at King's College in London, but she's also the lead researcher on subsea cables for UNIDIR. You have already presented and published with UNIDIR a report called Murky Waters, and a long title. And I have been told that Camino is also about to publish quite soon an additional report with UNIDIR on sea cables as critical infrastructures. Thank you so much for making the effort to come to Bern from Spain. I understand. We very much appreciate it. I have told you before, the topic why we wanted to talk about this is also due to the fact that recently many of the Swiss embassies abroad have been cut off because of sea cables being infringed somehow. And we thought it would be a good topic to somehow understand the practicalities on why we all depend so much on the sea cables, but then I'll also go a bit abroad and look more on the geopolitical topic. So Camino, in the morning, I think you said that the majority of people, honestly, including myself, believe that the internet, all the internet comes from satellite, and that's completely wrong. Could you walk us a bit through more like the practical issues of intercontinental sea cables, very practically, how does it work, how do they look like, and so that we probably understand the topic a bit more.
Sure, thank you Nina, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure. It's great to be here talking about this specific topic. I'm very passionate about it. I am not a technical expert on this. I'm not an optical engineer, but I have been following the topic quite closely now for a few years. And also focused on the topic when conducting my PhD research at King's College London some years ago. So yes, you're correct. Many people do believe that internet connectivity is provided via satellite, but actually over 95% of intercontinental data is transferred via subsea communications cables. This is increasing the capacity being provided via subsea cables, let's say subsea telecommunications cables is kind of the correct terminology to use. Yes, the capacity in those cables is increasing significantly, brought on by massive societal dependencies on cables and the connectivity that they provide. And the demand for capacity on such transmission technologies is projected to grow quite considerably over the next decade. And I think this is largely due to new services, or well, not new services, but services such as streaming and generative AI, which, as you know, are increasing not only in terms of services, but also in terms of the number of users that are coming on board. And so, yes, there are also a number of other dependencies from provision of essential services to the public and so forth that depend on the technologies.
Thank you, and I think you also, I now don't see the slides because of the issues, but I think you showed the map where we see the bare number of sea cables, or I'm sorry, I'm just using sea cables for the ease of the dialogue, and also how it goes from the sea to the land, right? Yes. So that it's not only sea, obviously, because it somehow has to get to the land.
Yeah. So there approximately 500 plus subsea telecommunications cables now. Most of those are already in operation, and some are projected to come into service in the coming years. And so if we look at the slide that I showed earlier, It's a very basic slide about what's in a subsea cable system. And here you have what the industry actors refer to as the wet plant, which is everything in the water and on the seabed. And then you have the dry plant, which would be from the beach manhole, where the cable comes out of the sea, to the cable landing station, onto the point of presence that then connects with the terrestrial network.
Right. And so it's kind of a basic infrastructure that we all rely on. You said, I think 95% relies on it. And I mean, as we've seen just right now, that the things didn't work sometimes because of a cable. It depends a lot. So is this like in the hands of the states, of like statal actors? Or maybe you can elaborate a bit on who's behind, who's responsible, and also responsible for providing new and for making sure that they work?
So first of all, maybe to roll back a little bit, so not every country depends equally on subsea communications cables for connectivity. Mm-hmm. That's very nuanced, depending on the geographical location and whether it's a coastal state or not. So we can have a further conversation about that. But yes, over 95% of intercontinental data does flow across these cables. In terms of the sorry, what was the question you asked again?
Like the actors.
Yes, the actors, yes.
State actors?
Yeah.
Is it
so
private actors?
The majority of these cables are owned and operated by the private sector, by industry actors. And that changes, again, depending on the region. Usually, or historically, they've been owned by consortia of different actors, which could be a mix of public-private or fully private and so forth. And you could have consortia with members with numerous or scores of owners. And some of these cables are very, very long. And so different owners would own segments of the cables and so forth. That's changing now. There are more and more private cables, and these private cables tend to be owned by the hyperscalers. So Google, Microsoft, Meta, and Amazon Web Services. So the architectures themselves are beginning to change in the sense that the cables don't necessarily go through the same structure that I mentioned in terms of the dry plant, the cable landing station. They may leapfrog that and go straight from data center to data center. So with the core equipment that is generally at a cable landing station, now hosted within a data center.
That's very interesting, because if you think about how we work, you mentioned Microsoft, for instance, that we have obviously Office, and then there's also the Microsoft Cloud. So somehow the whole chain of internet connectivity and how we work and how we connect has a certain tendencies to be in the hands of a very few actors. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, that's only for some cable systems.
Right.
So I think we have to be a little bit careful. At least I have to be a bit careful in how this is presented. But I don't think there's any doubt that the industry is changing, and the fact that a lot of data centers are now kind of hosting a lot of the data and all of this championed by growing use of AI, generative AI, and so forth. So data centers are kind of becoming evidently a critical architecture. Mm-hmm. And for some of the companies, if they can connect directly the data centers, then that makes it just more efficient and so forth, and more secure to some extent.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned security. That leads me to another question. As I said before, many of the colleagues that are hopefully also watching that, or maybe also watching that, have been cut off because of sea cable problems. Could you elaborate a bit about how vulnerable this system is? I think we've seen it on the map before, like the big numbers of cables and how they go. Yeah, and also maybe elaborate a bit on what can go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we consider them as they are, I mean, they're the diameter of a hose. Every actual fiber optic is the diameter of a hair. I mean, these seem very, very vulnerable, but at the same time, a lot of resilience is built into the systems from the very start. So they're built with general engineering principles of high resilience and redundancy.
Does that mean that if one breaks, it goes directly to another one? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
So traffic would be shifted to another cable and so forth. The challenge is for countries that are only connected by one or two cables. And I think we've seen the example of the earthquake off the coast of Tonga, a Pacific island, was it last year or the year before? That was totally disconnected because the cable connecting the country and the islands within its waters were totally damaged. There was a total fiber cut. So it took weeks and weeks to get that cable back online, and now there's strong emphasis on building additional cables to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Evidently, countries can fall back on satellite connectivity, but that can be very expensive. And it doesn't always work. We have now more options with the low Earth orbit satellites, but there are challenges also with those, from ownership structures all the way through to a growing pollution of a planetary of the orbitary plane.
And maybe again, like on the incidents. So you said they're very fragile. They still do have a plan B and C and D and E usually. But what can go wrong? I mean, is it earthquake? Can it also be human damaged or fish damaged? Or
no. There's the fish myth. Existed when they were coaxial cables, but now with fiber optic it's very, very different, and there are no incidents of sharks biting cables. According to the statistics, those collected by the International Cable Protection Committee, there are about 200 significant outages per year. Yes, those figures can change slightly, but the figure tends to be flat over the past decade at least. And those tend to be due to either geological phenomena, natural phenomena, earthquakes, landslides, underwater landslides, rock slides, turbidity currents. And then you have a lot of man-made, unintentional activity caused by commercial fishing, anchor drags, sporting activity at sea and so forth. That is a challenge. And in some regions, you have a lot of artisanal fishing, which makes it much more difficult to protect against, and also some of this can be illicit. That's what I'm talking about when protecting against, and that can create damage to the cables. Then, of course, we have some of the recent activity, which is fomenting many concerns, especially in the European context, where we had the Baltic connector incident, but also some cables connecting Finland and Estonia, Sweden and Estonia that were broken at the same time. There were incidents along the coast of Norway. There's been suspicious activity off the coast of Ireland, and so forth. So there is concern that there could be intentional activity, and that is not a new concern. I mean, if you go all the way back to pre-World War I era, cables have always been a target in situations of crisis and conflict for both sabotage and espionage purposes. And I think we also have to balance our concerns in the sense that they're not all maritime focused. There are also concerns about the landing stations, the network operation centers, and so forth. So there is a significant cyber security, network security element as well. And I think many countries are now organizing themselves about how to deal with both, with a very strong focus, not just on security, but also resilience.
Yeah. I think you already touched a bit upon, because I wanted to ask about how to look in this in terms of conflict, or in times of raising possible conflicts.
Yes.
But I think you actually already touched mostly upon that it's a, I wanted to say an easy, but it's obviously not an easy target, but it is a possible target. Is there something that you feel that countries are switching in how they protect it or how they collaborate with the private actors, because you
yes.
mentioned before.
Yes, very much so. Even just in the European context again, you're probably all very aware that NATO has established a critical undersea infrastructure coordination cell in Brussels to deal with kind of the strategic policy level and networking with industry actors. And then at Marcom in Northwood in the UK, they've also developed a maritime a centre for the security of critical undersea infrastructure, so more at the operational level. Right. The EU itself has put in place already, dealing with some of the network connectivity issues. There are new instruments or updated instruments. Also with the maritime level, they also have the updated maritime security strategy. In addition to all of these other instruments, they've just presented a recommendation on the security and resilience of subsea cables, which covers a range of issues all the way through from regulation through to greater hardening security, and also looking at available repair capabilities in situations of need.
But so there's several governance instruments that I hear from you from very different actors. But like, two questions: is there one, like, a global governance structure existing, and then also, because you mentioned before that the actors are very often like private actors from industry, some consortia, but also some of the hyperscalers. So yeah, if there's in the governance structure, is there like an interoperability between those, or is there an overarching structure? And also, what's the role of the industry there?
So the key international legal basis for subsea cables is the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. Right. And that includes several provisions on subsea communications cables, as well as for other kinds of undersea infrastructure. Several of those provisions, several of those provisions in UNCLOS have been taken up by different governments, and there's been a lot of work over the past decades in implementing some of those, but very, very slow progress, I think, in some instances. What's been very useful, I think, for many countries has been the work of the International Cable Protection Committee, an industry body that has over 160 members, I think, of both industry actors as well as some governments. And they put out a few years ago a recommendation on best practices for government, and that covers a number of resiliency issues, from cable protection, armoring, to regulation and so forth. Also sharing of the seabed questions between fisheries and other core policy areas for governments. So they're very, very useful. Like everything, they need to be updated, or they need to be assessed in terms of how the industry is shifting, as well as how government attention is shifting. Then from a government perspective, there are a number of other arrangements that are emerging. I mentioned the EU context. I used the hook of the UN Group of Governmental Experts report from 2015 and 2021, which includes a norm, a non-binding political norm related to state behaviour in
the DIGI principle, right? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So, my colleagues.
Exactly.
Know that.
So using that to suggest that states should also promote restraint in their behaviour and in their use of ICTs, and should not use ICTs to conduct internationally wrongful acts against infrastructure of another state. So that can be read and understood to include digital infrastructure. So that would be kind of more the cyber element. And now the follow-on UNIDIR study that I'm doing, that's looking at what it means in policy and practice when states actually consider or designate subsea communications cables as critical infrastructure. And it's been a remarkably interesting project in terms of understanding how states are how the topic is moving up the policy agenda across many governments, not just in Europe, but across the world. And not only in relation to coastal states, but also landlocked states. And this is a particular concern in Africa. As you mentioned earlier, the incidents off the west coast of Africa had quite a bit of impact, not only because of the incidents per se, but also because there had been incidents recently, just before that, on the east coast, but also in the Red Sea, which brings us back to the topic of conflict.
So in this study, is there many countries that already designate the sea cables as critical infrastructure? Do you have like an overview, like in terms of numbers?
No, it's very difficult to assess a number because governments could call them different things, or may designate a segment of a cable or a specific actor, industry operator, as a critical entity. Yes. So it's very nuanced, but I think what you see is more and more countries ensuring some kind of coordination around the topic. So having a single point of contact at the policy level that not only serves as a single point of contact for industry actors and for that kind of cooperation or coordination or sharing of information, but also across policy areas, because you see more and more interaction of this policy area with the energy sector, evidently with fisheries, that's always been the case, and then anything to do with the environment and so forth. And this links to another instrument that's key. It's the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions Treaty that was agreed just last year.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you say about this point of contact, because listening to you, it really seems to touch upon many different topics that you need somehow a whole of government approach, also within a country.
Yes, definitely.
Not speaking about the whole world, but also within a country. Yeah. So maybe just to finish, because we're advancing quite quickly in time. I also don't want to let people off from their other work, but. We're obviously a landlocked country. You have touched upon that very quickly with some African countries, but do you feel that also like landlocked countries should look more deeply into this role, or like the role of critical infrastructure of sea cables, and if so, how would they do that, or what would be your recommendation to a landlocked country?
Yes, speak with your operators, the operators in your country, speak with experts, technical experts, but I do think it's important for African countries in particular, where connectivity, they're not anywhere as connected as Switzerland might be. Right. Switzerland, I think, has significant redundancy throughout its systems, its terrestrial connectivity connections, but at the same time, understanding what the risks are is very important. So yes, definitely dialogue with existing partners such as the European Union, but for missions abroad, you mentioned embassies and so forth, understanding what the connectivity challenges may be and what redundancy is. I think many embassies would have significant redundancy, but understanding how that actually works in practice, and also doing exercises, especially at the embassy level, yeah.
Like practical, what to do when,
yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, but also probably have an interest in how the country deals with it, right?
Yes.
Or if it's an importance to the country.
Yeah, and also I think from a Swiss perspective, there are a number of other challenges or issues that I think Switzerland can engage in, including with regard to development support and capacity building. At the regulatory level, also, listening to some of the countries, the landlocked countries, and engaging with them in discussion about what their concerns are and so forth. I think there's still significant challenges in different regions, and understanding what they are is very important. I think Switzerland is well placed to do so. And then you mentioned the question of conflict earlier.
Right.
And I do think, just on the basis of work that I've been doing in the mediation sphere, that there is a huge amount of work to be done and integrating some of these considerations in not necessarily just subsea cables, but critical internet infrastructure in a given state or within its jurisdiction, including its territorial waters, and how that is often weaponized or increasingly weaponized during conflict. And I think that becomes extremely difficult when the ownership structures of the different infrastructure relate to broader third parties that may be supporting one conflict party or another. And that becomes extremely complicated to deal with, but something definitely that is a critical issue, also relating to the political economy issues and efforts to compete for control of specific infrastructures.
Right, thank you so much. I actually wanted to come back to this point because you mentioned it this morning. So I do hope, I'm also looking into the colleagues that the colleagues specifically from who do deal with mediation and peace and security. That's for sure a very important information. Thank you so much. So just before finishing, both of the reports that we mentioned, the one that's already out and the one that's being published, I think we will link it also when we to the talk, but I think just to the colleagues, if you Google Dr. Kavanagh, you will find it as well. And but we will link it. So because I do find it, the one that's already published, I did find it very helpful also to understanding this interconnectivity of a topic that we usually don't think about because it just seems so obvious that the internet runs, right? Yes. Thank you so much, Camino, for having made the effort to explaining us a tiny bit. I know it was only the surface from your very broad knowledge, but it has been incredibly helpful for me, and I hope also for you, the audience. Allow me just to close here. This is the finish of the first circle of these DIGI Talks before the summer break. We will now go to the anticipated summer break because it's actually only June. But we will resume after it, and we will inform you through the usual channels on the next topic, also on the next date. And we will also link to the archive where you can see all the other previous interviews that we did. Thank you so much for joining, and again, apologies for the not live streaming. It was a tiny stressful moment for us as well, and I do hope that you can watch it, and I do hope that that you enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and see you in after the summer break.
Thank you.
Thank you, Camino.
Thank you.